In 2003, a team of archaeologists descended into a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores and found something so unexpected, so biologically strange, that it forced scientists to rewrite the entire story of human evolution. The remains belonged to a fully grown adult, barely 3.5 feet tall, with a brain the size of a chimpanzee, yet unmistakably a toolmaker, a hunter, and a member of a human species that had lived on that island for over 100,000 years. And then around 50,000 years ago, they were simply gone. No one knows what happened to them, and every answer scientists have proposed raises more questions than it resolves. This is the story of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Flores, and the greatest unsolved disappearance in the fossil record. The cave is called Liang Bua, and it sits in the western highlands of Flores, an island east of Bali in the Indonesian archipelago. Local legends had long spoken of small, mysterious people who once lived in the forests, creatures called Ebu Gogo, said to be tiny, silent, and capable of mimicking human speech. The locals told stories of them well into the 19th century. Whether those stories reflect a cultural memory of actual encounters with Homo floresiensis or are simply folklore is impossible to say. But the legends were there, and when the excavation team broke through to deeper chambers of Liang Bua in September of 2003, they found the truth was stranger than any myth. The first skeleton, known to science as LB1, was remarkably complete. The adult female stood about 3 feet 6 inches tall. Her brain volume was roughly 380 cubic centimeters, about the same as a chimp, or a very early human ancestor like Australopithecus. Her wrists were primitive. Her shoulders suggested a climbing lifestyle. Her feet were surprisingly long relative to her legs, a configuration not seen in modern humans. And yet she had lived alongside stone tools, alongside evidence of butchered animals, alongside a community of people who had thrived in that environment for generations. The initial scientific reaction was skeptical, almost hostile. Many researchers argued LB1 was simply a modern human, a Homo sapiens, with a pathological condition like microcephaly or Down syndrome. They suggested she was an anomaly, a sick individual, not a separate species. The debate raged for years. Then in 2004, the team found more remains, more individuals. LB6, a second, smaller set of bones. A jaw, arm fragments. More skeletons emerged over subsequent excavations, eventually totaling 9 distinct individuals. You can't have 9 pathological individuals in the same cave across the same narrow time period. The pattern of variation in those 9 individuals, the same unusual features repeated across adults and children alike, became impossible to dismiss. Homo floresiensis was a real species, a distinct human species, and it had vanished with no obvious explanation around 50,000 years ago. So what was it exactly? Where did it come from, and why was it so small? The leading theory is one of the most dramatic in all of biology: island dwarfism. Flores is an island surrounded by deep ocean, with no land bridges ever connecting it to mainland Asia. When a large mammal becomes isolated on an island with limited resources, evolution frequently shrinks it. This is called insular dwarfism, and it's well documented. The island of Flores had its own dwarf elephants, tiny relatives of the massive species that once roamed Asia, and giant rodents the size of dogs. Under these conditions, a body size that was normal on the mainland became a liability. Smaller bodies need less food. So over hundreds of thousands of years, Homo erectus, or perhaps an even earlier wave of human migration, shrank, down to the size of a modern human child. But the brain didn't shrink in proportion to the body. The cognitive capacity stayed. The alternative theory is even more extraordinary, that Homo floresiensis descended from a much earlier human ancestor. Not Homo erectus at all, but something closer to Homo habilis, or even a late surviving Australopithecus. That would mean an unknown species left Africa roughly 1.8 million years ago, traveled all the way across Asia, and reached Flores, surviving there in isolation for well over 1 million years. The anatomical features, particularly the primitive wrist bones in the shape of the foot, are consistent with this idea, though the evidence remains circumstantial and the scientific community hasn't reached a consensus. What is clear is that Homo floresiensis represents an extraordinary experiment in human evolution, a parallel branch of the human family tree, living at the same time as Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and the Denisovans, and completely unknown to science until 20 years ago. Here is the central mystery. Around 50,000 years ago, Homo floresiensis disappears from the fossil record. No later remains have ever been found on Flores or anywhere else, and the timing is suspicious. Because 50,000 years ago is also roughly when anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Southeast Asia. We don't know exactly when Homo sapiens first set foot on Flores itself. The earliest evidence of human presence on Flores that is unambiguously Homo sapiens dates to somewhere between 46 and 47,000 years ago. But our species was in the broader region, in Borneo, in Sulawesi, in the islands to the west, by at least 50,000 years ago. Whether the arrival of Homo sapiens directly caused the disappearance of Homo floresiensis is not something we can state with certainty. But the coincidence is difficult to ignore. The first theory is the simplest, that Homo sapiens outcompeted them. Modern humans had larger brains, more sophisticated tools, more complex social structures, and higher population densities. Wherever Homo sapiens expanded, other human species tended to dwindle and disappear, a pattern we see across the entire globe. In Flores, resources were limited. A new, more efficient hunter-gatherer with more advanced technology arriving on the scene would have placed enormous pressure on an isolated population of a few thousand individuals at most. Extinction through competitive displacement is slow in geological terms, but fast in human terms. A population declining over a few centuries, eventually falling below the threshold where it can sustain itself. The second theory is more specific to Flores itself. The island is volcanically active. Lake Sagara Anak, a volcanic crater lake near the summit of Mount Rinyani, was formed during a massive eruption. Some researchers have argued that a catastrophic volcanic eruption on Flores, possibly from a nearby cone, could have wiped out the Homo floresiensis population directly through ashfall, climate cooling, or habitat destruction. The problem with this theory is that the major Flores eruption, most often cited, occurred closer to 12,000 years ago, well after Homo floresiensis had already vanished from the record. There may have been earlier, undocumented eruptions that left no clear geological signature. It's possible. But as of now, there's no smoking gun linking a specific volcanic event to their disappearance. The third theory is perhaps the most haunting. Disease. When Homo sapiens expanded into new territories, we brought pathogens with us. Pathogens to which we had built up immunity over thousands of years, but to which isolated populations had none. This mechanism has been proposed to explain the disappearance of the Neanderthals, and it could apply here as well. A population of Homo floresiensis living on a small island with no contact with other human populations for hundreds of thousands of years would have had no resistance to diseases brought by incoming Homo sapiens. A single introduced pathogen could have spread through a small, isolated community with devastating speed. What makes the disappearance of Homo floresiensis particularly difficult to understand is how little evidence it has left behind. With the Neanderthals, we have burial sites, hybrid DNA evidence, and a timeline that spans tens of thousands of years across Europe and Western Asia. With Homo floresiensis, we have one cave, 9 individuals, and a vanishing point that we can date only within broad ranges. The island of Flores may hold more sites. Perhaps there are other caves, other chambers, waiting to be found. But as of now, the silence from the fossil record after 50,000 years ago is total. They were there, and then they weren't. If there's a broader story here, it's one that should make any modern human slightly uncomfortable, because Homo floresiensis was not alone in vanishing. Around the time our species began spreading out of Africa, the world was home to at least 8 distinct human species: Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo floresiensis, the Denisovans of Siberia and East Asia, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, Homo erectus in Java, Homo naledi in South Africa, and at least one other in China whose classification remains debated. Within 30 to 40,000 years of Homo sapiens beginning its global expansion, every single one of those other species was gone. This is not a coincidence. It is not a random cluster of unrelated events. It is the pattern of one human species replacing all the others. How exactly that replacement happened, whether through war, through disease, through ecological pressure, or through a combination of all three, is still debated. But the outcome is not in dispute. We are here. They are not. Homo floresiensis is just the most mysterious of the lost ones, the one we knew nothing about until 2 decades ago. There is, though, one more unsettling possibility worth mentioning. Some researchers have noted that the disappearance of Homo floresiensis aligns broadly with the arrival of Homo sapiens across much of Southeast Asia and Australia. But Flores was, and is, difficult to reach. The island sits in a region of powerful ocean currents, deep water, and unpredictable weather. Could Homo sapiens have actually reached Flores 50,000 years ago, earlier than the archaeological record currently confirms? If so, the overlap between the two species on that island would have been longer than we imagine. And if Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis coexisted on Flores, even briefly, the archaeological record has not yet told us what that looked like. There are no clear signs of conflict, no obvious evidence of cultural exchange, just an abrupt end. The cave at Liangbua continues to be excavated. New chambers are still being explored. And every new discovery has the potential to rewrite what we think we know. Perhaps there are remains of Homo floresiensis that post-date 50,000 years ago. Perhaps there is evidence of interaction with Homo sapiens that simply hasn't been found yet. The story, as of now, is unfinished. But here is the takeaway that stays with you after the evidence runs out. For most of human history, this planet was home to more than one kind of human. Different species, different faces, different ways of being in the world. We like to think of human history as a single, continuous story. One people, one species, marching forward. But the fossil record tells a different story. It tells of branches, of dead ends, of extraordinary experiments in biology and consciousness that flourished for hundreds of thousands of years, and then, quietly without fanfare, were extinguished. Homo floresiensis is not the most dramatic human species to vanish. That distinction probably belongs to the Neanderthals, who left behind art, burial sites, and genetic traces that still live on in some of us today. But Homo floresiensis is the one that vanished the most completely. They left no descendants, no DNA in modern populations, no trace beyond one cave on one island, and no explanation for why they went. 50,000 years ago, somewhere on the island of Flores, the last member of a species that had survived for 100,000 years took their final breath. There was no one left to mourn them, no one to record it. The forest reclaimed the cave. The volcanic soil covered their tools, and for the next 50 millennia, the world forgot they had ever existed. We find them now in the dust of a dig site. We piece together their story from fragments of bone and stone. And we are left with a question that science may never fully answer. What happened to the people who were here before us? The answer, whatever it turns out to be, matters, because the forces that eliminated Homo floresiensis, competition, disease, environmental collapse, are not ancient history. They are the same forces that shape the world today. Understanding what happened to them isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about understanding what can happen to any species that thinks it's permanent. The hobbits of Flores didn't leave a written record. They left no monuments, no cities, no legends that survived across the deep time of their extinction. What they left is bones and tools and a single devastating silence that has lasted 50,000 years. And in that silence, if we listen carefully, we might hear the sound of every species that came before us, and the reminder that none of them made it. Not all of us will. The story of Homo floresiensis doesn't end with their extinction. It ends with us, the only human species left, finally, after all this time, beginning to ask the right questions about who they were and why they disappeared. And that, perhaps, is how we honor them. Not by pretending they never existed, but by refusing to let their story end in silence.